Hey everybody, welcome back to the Grounded Seeker podcast. This is episode 9. My name's Sam. In this episode, we're talking about discovering your core shadows driving dysfunctional behavior in your life. And I've put in brackets for free. There are a lot of powerful online resources that we can use to go about this. And today, I want to sort of give you a bit of a landscape, a bit of a path forward on how you can really go about doing that and understanding yourself in a very deep way, understanding why you do the things you do, why you are the way you are, which is critical because, I'll play this clip from Adyashanti, which really sets the scene for this.
And I think everybody, teachers and students, need to understand this. You can still not have your emotional human ego act together at all, even if you have really big, powerful spiritual experiences. I mean real ones, not phony stuff. We have to encounter both of these domains simultaneously, but I think we have to get over the idea that spiritual insight is a cure for everything, number one. That it's the same as emotional growth. That's not true. It can help a lot with emotional growth.
Right. So what Adyashanti is pointing out there is he acknowledges the interpenetration of the spiritual development, the cultivation of insight, alongside the development of a healthy sense of self. And they go hand in hand and they interpenetrate. And that we can either become very developed in one of them, so for example, very deep in insight-based practice, without any sort of like deep investigation of our shadow, and we could be very developed in that spectrum, but we might be very underdeveloped in the shadow spectrum. And in which case we enact unskillful behaviors, like we hear about stories of various lineage holders sexually exploiting their students and doing all these sorts of things. So just feeding that in, and I'll leave the YouTube, the link to that YouTube video with a timestamp on where that was sort of brought up, if you want to check it out and go further into it after this. And from my experience, what I ended up doing was initially I would double down very, very hard on insight-based practices, resting as awareness, noticing the non-dual quality of experience, how we're not separate from anything. Yet while I would do this, meditating for hours per day, it would stir up a lot of emotional material in the psyche. So what essentially felt like was, yes, I could identify my fundamental nature of being, my true nature, which is a very important and crucial recognition, in my opinion, which I talk about in episode 2, why true healing can only really take place when we connect to our true self. However, if we double down solely on those sorts of practices, only insight-based practice, we can sort of get transfixed by the idea of awakening, by the idea of enlightenment. And if our nervous system is kicking up a lot of material, we can sort of, we don't really look there, and we don't look to understand the sense of self and why this emotional material is arising, because maybe we hear teachings from, non-dual teachers that we look up to that say, don't worry about addressing that stuff. Don't worry about healing. There's no one to heal. There's no one to do anything. And I'm feeling a little bit of anger swell up in my system when I hear these sorts of things for people with trauma, because I don't believe that's the right message that we need to hear. Because again, as Adyashanti says, we can be a very developmentally immature human being and still have insight. So what we want to do is discover our blind spots. What we want to do is, maybe if we have a really sincere non-dual practice, we want to just sort of open up our aperture of awareness a bit more and look to see, what are my most fundamental shadows driving my behavior? Right? So, and there are many ways that we can sort of look and discover what our core shadows are. I'm going to suggest a few approaches that I've found to be most useful, and this comes from direct experience. This isn't a psychotherapeutic diagnosis, so please hold this with a grain of salt and trust your instinct as always with these sorts of things. This is something I would like to share from experience, and again, it's been very, very helpful for me, where having this understanding of what my core shadows are has shifted the lens significantly in developing myself in that healthy sense of self direction outside of insight-based practice. So really, what this boils down to, if we are serious about truth, serious about awakening, serious about being happier, healthier, more authentic, more empowered, what's getting in the way of that is our shadow. So the most fundamental question that we can ask to discover our core shadows driving dysfunction in our life is essentially, what am I most afraid of? And I mean not just like answering that question lightly. I mean taking that to heart, letting that question sort of drop like a pebble into the middle of your heart and ripple outward through your whole being, so that contemplation, what am I most afraid of, becomes a burning question in your psyche, sort of like you would with the question of who am I when practicing non-dual investigations. But what am I most afraid of? And sort of sticking with it, sort of like a bit of a koan in a way, a Zen koan, although that's just a light analogy. A koan is meant to sort of turn off the mind, but in this sense, we're sticking with such a question such that it ripples through our being. And we might sit with that question not only for one meditation sit, we might sit with that through the week, because it's possible that in our current consciousness, maybe we're really caffeinated right now, for example, while we listen to a podcast, or we've just come on a emotional high or something like that. And our consciousness is a little bit different when we ask that question. But then when we ask it tomorrow, perhaps we're in a lower mood and we're really in contact and kissing some of that really dysfunctional behavior that's been driving our lives. So when we ask that question again, what am I most afraid of? Then we start to realize that, oh yeah, there are these things. There's this like social anxiety complex that I have, or there's this really scary job interview that I have coming up, and I'm really scared of failure, or I'm terrified of going back to the workplace, or there's all these different variations that can emerge if we space that question out throughout something like a week or multiple meditation sits, and really sitting with that inquiry and journaling it out. So that in this way, if we do this, we develop a more cohesive understanding of ourselves rather than just a one and done sort of approach. And other sort of variations of that we can sort of deepen that question could be something like, what emotions am I afraid of experiencing? What situations am I consistently meeting in my daily life where my authenticity is impaired? Or what is currently causing me the most fundamental and painful emotional distress in my life consistently that is perplexing me? And see how we just take a gentle sort of like, not a approach of, what's wrong with me, man? Like, got all these horrible things existing in my consciousness. It's more like we're excavating our consciousness with compassion, and we're just sort of really seeing, like, taking full blameless inventory of why we are the way we are, why we do the things that we do. And in that process, we develop metacognition of our sense of self, like why we are the way we are. So that's one approach. That's probably the lowest barrier of entry approach. Simply just trusting our own experience and going in, turning inward, and contemplating this question with sincerity. And ultimately, you have to decide where you're at with how sincere you want to take that investigation. There's no rules to this. Like, someone could, ask that question once, and it could just penetrate the first layer of their experience. Someone could ask that question with all of their heart, because they're suffering so deeply and they really want to know why they are the way they are, such that the answer is richer, more comprehensive, and deeper. So it's really a spectrum of how earnest you are about that process of self-investigation when you ask that question. When people have a clearer comprehension of the areas of their life that they are sort of thwarted in, that empowers them significantly to say, hey, this is what I want to work on. This is what I'm struggling with. And I'm ready. I want to go into this. Let's do this. Rather than having this sort of vague, foggy, sometimes even desperate sense of uncertainty about why they are the way they are. Because maybe they're doubling down on a non-dual practice. And, I've definitely done this myself, so I speak from experience. They're doubling down on a non-dual practice or a really serious spiritual practice. And they're so they're doing that practice from a sense of angst and anxiety that they want to wake up quickly so that they can sort of get on with their lives finally. But in the process, they're sort of abandoning themselves a little bit there because they're neglecting these emotional facets of their experience by not really looking at them fully and wholeheartedly. And they're sort of just pushing them off to the side, I'll deal with them later once I'm enlightened or once I'm awake or something, right? So my invitation would be just to slow down and really drop that question into the heart of consciousness. What am I most afraid of? What emotions am I afraid of experiencing? Am I afraid of showing anger? Am I afraid of showing sadness to people? Am I afraid of showing fear? What situations am I consistently meeting in my life where my authenticity is impaired? What is currently causing the most mental distress for me? These sorts of questions. Now, that sort of investigation can honestly it can really only take us so far. And that's because we have blind spots. We have areas in our consciousness that even when we inquire into our experience, we're not going to get an answer because we have yet to be educated on them. That's why they're called blind spots. We're blind to them. We don't even know that they're there. So we need other systems as well in adjunct to our own deep and sincere investigation that can broaden our view of ourselves. And the good news is, and I'm going to present a couple of models now as well that are going to significantly pull out and deepen your understanding if you inquire into them and follow the tests and these sorts of things, these free online tests that I'm going to recommend. So we're also called to pull out a little bit wider and look at some frameworks that currently exist that are gold standard for identifying shadows in our experience at a very deep level and comprehensive level at that. And there's been huge developments in Western psychology that really give us frameworks and context to understand the most profoundly deep woundings that we experience in our psyche. So the first one is attachment theory. Now, attachment theory is incredibly profound because essentially it is the theory that surrounds our development, how we attach to people in our lives. And that attachment is essentially based upon our interactions with our caregivers at our earliest time of development. And the reason this model is so effective is because it essentially, it's from the ground up, right? We act the way we act largely based upon, and significant amounts of the way we act is based upon the way that our parents raised us from their own internal working models, right? For example, from the ages of 0 from birth to 6 months of age, we are basically neural sponges absorbing everything that our parents are doing with us. So if we cry and our parents reject us, they don't meet our needs, that brain, that neural developmental system will acknowledge that. And because it's simply following the path of least resistance to get its needs met at that time, at the baby's psyche, it's designed in such a way that if our parents repress certain aspects of themselves, say if we cry, they don't like that, they don't attune to us properly and skillfully, then we learn that, okay, maybe tears are bad. And that becomes deeply entrenched in our nervous system, right? And then as we grow older, as adults, we learn that this stuff is so baked into our nervous system from before we could even think rationally, because our cortex hadn't been designed at this point in our lives, that we develop these ways of relating with other humans, so that our nervous system, when we go to show tears in this example to people that we're close with, like in relationship with our caregivers, in relationship with our partners, with our wives, with our husbands, these attachment wounds are so caked into the system that all we feel is emotional dysregulation or some sort of resistance or something like this. And as such, it can be very perplexing as to why we feel so uncomfortable around other people, right? So attachment theory sort of covers all of this understanding. In our most developmental years, why are we the way we are? We can be categorized as avoidant, as anxious, or as disorganized attachment, or secure attachment, where we're healthy, where we had healthy, good enough parents who were able to support us. Basically, everyone that I've worked with in somatic inquiry who I've gotten to take one of these online tests to see what their attachment relationship is, basically all of them have some sort of attachment related issue, which is also my experience. I've dealt with avoidant attachment. So we want to understand this, right? See how this is like feeding into the sense of self narrative. So there's the insight-based axis, and there's also the developmental, like healthy self axis, the human aspect. Because again, just re-emphasizing, we can be very deeply awake, but if we're not aware of our attachment wounds, our most fundamental attachment woundings, or what we're most afraid of, and we keep glazing over these sorts of questions, then we're thwarting the human development, perhaps out of an emotional wounding, right? And we want to become aware of these emotional wounds. So the attachment theory test, I'll put a link in the description. There's a free one by the Attachment Project, which is, I think, Daniel P. Brown had some influence in, along with an Australian entrepreneur who developed this website. But essentially, if you take that free test, you'll get a result of while it's not a diagnosis, and there are more advanced ways that you can be diagnosed, and you could always take it to a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist to further elaborate upon this, or also take the AAI, which is a very profound, like very deep scoring of your attachment wounds. These are other options as well, and that will cost a bit of money to do an AAI. However, you can take and just get a general understanding of where you might land on the attachment spectrum if you take that free online test. And this test will probably take you something about 15 to 20 minutes. And the reason it's so good is because it asks you all of these questions that you might not have ever even considered to help paint this picture of what your childhood was like. And then you get this result that can give you a ballpark understanding of where your attachment diagnoses may lie. So it's not a diagnosis, but it's a nice way to see like where you might lie on that spectrum. And I know a lot of people who are in these spheres have done a lot of this work, and that you may have already been diagnosed or sort of taken an attachment test. So I understand, just feel free to do it if you want to. I've had like one or two clients say that, like I've done this sort of research before, but then when I've done it again recently with you, I've done it on my own terms, and now we're working with it in session and bringing in these themes. Now all of a sudden, like, holy crap, it actually lands so much more deeper. Like I didn't even think anything of it before, but now it's very significant. So that's something to keep in mind as well. You might want to do it again and just see where you lie now, or whatever you want to do. And I'll leave a link in the description to do that. So then you can understand yourself. And just see how this is also pulling you out more. It's pulling you out from what you think you know about yourself. And it's sort of filling in the gaps of your understanding that might answer those questions that are sort of niggling in the back of your mind around, like, why is non-duality not helping me? Why am I still suffering so much? Or even though I've been doing this, non-resistance or being with sensation, man, I still feel really socially anxious all the time. And I would say that what's going on there is we have these sorts of things running in the background, like attachment wounds and unhealthy internal working model, or a developmentally adaptive internal working model that we learned in childhood, that is still running in the background. Sort of like our computer software is still running all of these developmental programs. And even though we might have insight, we're still building and running off that computer underneath. Now, in addition to the attachment project tests on attachment styles that I've recommended, they also have on that website a really good test to gauge your schemas. Now, schema, what's a schema? And how is it important to understanding your core shadows driving your behavior? Well, this one is quite profound, because essentially the background is that there was a gentleman who, the creator of the Schema Therapy modality, essentially came up with what I believe is 18 different schemas. And a schema is essentially a developmentally adaptive strategy that we might have that essentially is running in the background of our lives. And, for example, there might be ones such as subjugation or failure, where we just feel like a failure in our lives. And the idea behind these schemas is that they were needed at some point in our lives. We needed to be a failure. We needed to subjugate. We needed to get other people's validation. We needed to seek their approval all of the time. We needed to put our needs secondary and other people's needs as primary. These sorts of things, because perhaps our caregivers necessitated these developmental strategies in order for us to stay safe and get love. And not just only our caregivers, but maybe even friendship groups, or early relationships, early other relationships, these sorts of things. So we develop these schemas, which have been mapped out very comprehensively through this testing, to essentially understand ourselves more, these developmentally adaptive schemas. So again, this is on the same website, and I'll also include a link to this test as well. And you may like to take it slow, right? Maybe you just did an attachment test. Maybe you just paused this podcast and now I'm suggesting another thing, right? Because the schema test is a set of 255 questions under each schema, right? So it's a very comprehensive thing. It might take you quite a bit of time, maybe like an hour, to really answer all of those questions sincerely. And then you also have to sort of contextualize that, make sense of that as well, and understand and put these into categories. And that's, and see how it plays into your life, whether or not it's true, maybe read into it a bit. So these things are something that, depending on how burning you are to understand your schemas, you might like to do this. And yet it is important to, I believe, when we feel ready, to keep understanding ourselves, to keep knowing ourselves at a deeper level, so that we're not falling into these blind spots consistently in our lives, and we are empowered with self-knowledge, and we come out of denial of these patterns that have been running in the background our whole lives, and just use this as to paint a continued and bigger picture of our experience. But again, what we're doing here is we're broadening out our understanding of why we are the way we are. We're understanding our most fundamental conditionings that are sort of like the computer of our consciousness, like all of the scripts that have been instilled into us karmically through our, causes and conditions growing up. So I would encourage you to take that test as well. And through that schema test, what it will do is illuminate to you the primary schemas, the developmentally adaptive schemas that are driving your life, that are in the background, that the sorts of things like, why do I keep doing this behavior? Well, you can understand it when you take such a test as the schema test, and then you look at the results and study the results. It begins to form a more cohesive narrative. And again, just putting this into perspective, right? So say you've done the Schema Therapy test, say you've done the attachment test, say you've done that and really taken to heart a question like, what am I most afraid of? See how you're now developing a much deeper understanding of the human condition, of your unique human condition and blueprint, that something like resting as awareness or just noticing sensations on the insight-based spectrum of development, which is incredibly important. But you're also attuning to that human faculty as well. And yeah, so again, I'll put a link in the description for the Schema Therapy test, and I encourage you to take that as well. Now, the next one is, and this will be the last one that I include in this episode. And I'm sure there are many, many, many models for understanding ourselves. This is a couple models that I've found to be most useful. But the next model is Scott Kiloby's work, the emotional repression test. And this test is really important because what Scott Kiloby has essentially discovered with his work, which integrates nicely, if you don't know Scott Kiloby's story, I've got a plane flying over me, if you can hear that. If you don't know Scott Kiloby's story, he essentially was a non-dual teacher for 10 years. And Scott essentially realized that he was resting as awareness, and yet he was dealing with things like suicidality and even things like testicular cancer and these sorts of challenges, and lower back pain, very deep chronic pain. And no amount of resting as awareness was essentially opening him up. He felt very deeply repressed. And so Scott essentially developed a modality, the Kiloby inquiries, which I draw from as well. And I've worked with Scott, and he's a good facilitator, that addresses this problem by looking at more of the human aspect and addressing the emotional repression that is underpinning our behavior. And from a deeper understanding of this, essentially what's happening is a lot of our anxiety, a lot of our depression, a lot of our core identities can sometimes be built, or more than often are built, upon repressed emotions. For example, if I am told by my parents that I am only good and lovable and acceptable, either overtly they communicate that if I express something, or covertly, where it's an agreement where, like, if let's say I express anger in front of my parents, and as a child, either very developmentally where I have a tantrum, and these are things I can't even remember happening, and the parent figure will essentially reject and deny this behavior and not meet my needs. Like, let's say I'm angry, like I'm really angry that you did that, and then mum or dad or whatever primary caregiver is looking after me, see that when I'm angry, and they shut me down and they say, go to your room, like just go, you bad boy, like come back when you're ready, come back when you're healthy and you're in a right state of mind again. What does the kid learn? The kid learns that, oh, okay, if I express anger, I'm a bad person, I'm not good, and I'm not going to get love. Or it could be the other way around, maybe something like hurt. If I show my sadness, then I get told the message from dad that, harden up, boys don't cry. Only anger is the way, right? So then we learn that, okay, I got to repress my sadness. I've got to repress that and hide that at all costs. Otherwise, dad's not going to love me. He's going to think I'm weak and I won't get his love. And this has significant, extremely significant developmental challenges that then cascade into our lives. Where, if, for example, we learn at a very young age that if I express anger, I get shut down, I get rejected, we're never able to set boundaries, right? Because anger is the driving force of how we set healthy boundaries, how we say no and mean no when we say it, right? So if we do that over a lifetime where we can just never say no, we're always people pleasing, we're just this calm, collected, cool cat all of the time, but we're boiling with rage underneath, that our nervous system has literally repressed out of our awareness. We don't even know it's there. We might feel it as like a freeze energy in the body, or like feel a lot of shame at the thought of even expressing an emotion like anger. Then we need to make that conscious, and we need to process that sort of emotion. So there are tests that we can take in this regard as well. But most fundamentally, if we're just sitting in meditation and we just notice our primary caregivers in an imagination process, and we just entertain the idea of different emotional expressions in front of them, in front of our primary caregivers, in front of people close to us, like our siblings, in front of friendship groups, in front of our partner. We imagine these people and cycle through them with imagination. And we imagine ourselves, cycling through different emotions, starting with something like anger, just sort of dropping this question in, like, I can express anger to these people, no problem at all. To mum, to dad, just journaling out, okay, like, what does my nervous system say? What does my body say? Is there a feeling of, oh, no, like, there's no possible way I could ever express anger to them? Or there's no possible way that they would, I could let myself do such a thing. Like, anger's bad, right? So we have to listen to what our nervous system tells us about these emotions. And that's very interesting data. And it might feel very real, and it might be even co-opted by spiritual concepts. Just as a random example, like, Thich Nhat Hanh didn't say this, but, maybe we read like a Thich Nhat Hanh quote or something where, like, but spiritual people don't get angry, That's just not nice, like, I've got to send metta and loving kindness to these sorts of people. Right. And yet in that process, it's a subtle, sneaky, developmentally adaptive way that we've doubled down on our repression of these sorts of emotions. Or we might bounce between something like hurt as well. Like, I can show my deepest grief to my parents. And then again, we might get, all sorts of resistance with that. Or we might get a sense of, yeah, actually, that would be okay. Like, they would be able to support me. Or I can show joy to these parents, to my siblings, to my friends, to my closest loved ones. Or I can really show love. No problem at all. Or I can really show anxiety and fear to them. And you just test out different emotions, like, try on all sorts of, like, there's all sorts of emotions that we could try, and I'll include an emotional chart in the description. It's best if you work with the primary emotions, because they're probably the most broad sweeping emotions. And then there are subcategories of emotions. For example, like anger might have frustration underneath it. So if you just work with like anger, sadness, joy, fear, and shame, these sorts of emotions, they're probably really good ones to start with, right? And then the more you do this work, the more you funnel down into those nuanced emotions. So that's a really interesting investigation as well. And it also ties into attachment. So all of these things sort of overlap to a degree, these sorts of testings. So again, depending on how sincere and how earnest you are about these sorts of investigations, you might only be inclined right now to just do that first question, and just sit with that first question of like, what am I most afraid of? Right? Because this is a lot of stuff I'm throwing at you. And then, maybe one day, or depending how motivated you are, you might want to jump straight into this sort of stuff right after this podcast. You might go do the attachment theory test, you might go do the schema test, then you might just like sort of sit for meditation and do like, okay, what am I repressing? What emotions am I repressing? Listening to your body and seeing if there's any contraction or tightness or resistance in the process when you're doing that repression test. And yeah, ultimately you're just gently and compassionately and slowly building out a much richer, deeper understanding of why you do the things you do, why you might be suffering. And these are the models that have helped me most significantly personally in understanding myself in a much richer way. And I'm sure there's going to be more in the future. These are the ones that I've become aware of, and they're quite profound, right? Now, beyond this, understanding is key, deepening in our knowledge of why we do the things that we do. And there are all sorts of powerful resources out there. I would just nudge you and I would encourage you that don't fall victim to these sorts of non-dual messaging that you might receive of like, if there's no one to do anything, if there's no sense of self, why would I continue to, do self-improvement? Or this sounds like self-improvement and I'm way beyond that now. I'm like an enlightened master or whatever. I would just keep an open mind and heart to exploring and deepening in your understanding of psychopathologies and these sorts of things like, emotional repression, attachment wounding, schemas. Keeping an open mind and heart, I would just be mindful if the mind is throwing up resistance to doing something like that. Like, that's too much for me right now. I'm just going to keep resting as awareness. Just keep doubling down. But we can also be gentle with ourselves. We don't have to do all of this stuff at once because it can be quite overwhelming to get like result after result after result. And we might not even want to look at these things. So I would just encourage you to be really gentle with yourself. Like really only bite off what you can chew. And if you naturally feel like you want to understand yourself more, these are some options that I'm throwing your way. And other resources can be valuable. Like once we understand the problem, once we understand like sort of a rough idea of why we might be doing, again, this, I'm not diagnosing you or like these aren't diagnostic tools. It's best to see a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist. But then you can deepen in your understanding once you have that baseline sort of recognition of what might be driving your behavior. Like you might get an attachment result of, oh yeah, like I have an avoidant attachment. Oh shit, yeah, okay, I see how I have these schemas that are running my life. So then the next step is basically to deepen your understanding and enrichen the understanding of these things significantly by reading into them much more deeply, either through the resources that are provided through those free websites. And I can also recommend some other fantastic YouTube creators, people like Tim Fletcher, makes a lot of good content around trauma, complex trauma, developmental trauma, these sorts of things, where you can really understand and deepen in your awareness. People like Heidi Priebe is a fantastic resource. She's the sort of person who has walked the path and produces incredibly deep, rich content on addressing these sorts of challenges with practical takeaways and these sorts of things. For example, if you realize you had like an avoidant attachment style, you might look at Heidi Priebe's videos on avoidant attachment. Or you might look at Tim Fletcher's videos on certain, say you have like a failure schema, then maybe you could look at Tim Fletcher's videos on failure and understanding in a much deeper way. And also reading these resources. So you're deepening and you're broadening your sense of understanding about why you do the things that you do in a compassionate and gentle way, rather than being completely unconscious to them, which is unfortunately prevalent in spiritual spheres, and just neglecting them entirely. And then where do we go with that once we have this understanding, right? Well, the next step would be to find a facilitator with experience in these areas, ideally. Someone who's walked the path. And I would say someone ideally experiential, someone who works with experiential modalities that changes the nervous system and the way that we respond at the root by feeling into bodily sensations. And not to toot my own horn, but I am one of these facilitators. I facilitate somatic inquiry, so that's an option. But ultimately, feeling out for someone that you resonate with. This is a really good way to go. You could also seek out, obviously, professionals, like very deep professionals in this area, like a psychiatrist, especially when it comes to diagnoses, because these free tests aren't definitive. They are not diagnostic. You need to actually, see someone who's very trained in these areas to clarify these diagnoses once and for all. And I would essentially say, where do you go? Where can you continue to go with this? Well, it's just an ongoing investigation and practice at the experiential level to understand these modes more deeply in your life, like keeping an open heart. Oh yeah, like, wow, I just noticed, like, yeah, I see how that avoidant behavior is playing out in my life. Why did I do that? Why was that developmentally adaptive? Wow, that's so interesting. And deepening in that understanding just continuously, it just we can go so deep with these things. We think we know everything about ourselves, and then something like 3 months later, we realize, like, oh my goodness, yeah, Jesus. I thought, how naive was I to think that I knew everything then? Jeez. Just keeps deepening, right? And ultimately, we just want to be consistent with our practice, with our investigation, with our working on these things. Rome wasn't built in a day, that classic saying. We have to go brick by brick, slowly inclining and retraining and rewiring the mind into these idealized states of, more authenticity, deeper embodiment, deeper joy and happiness, and deeper intimacy and connection with others. All these lovely things that come through that age-old saying of know thyself, right? So we're coming to know thyself, yo. We do it through these sorts of processes, these gold standard processes. So fantastic. I hope this helped you guys. I really appreciate you listening. And yeah, I really hope you got a lot out of this episode. So subscribe to my newsletter. I've got a 90-day course that I'm going to be launching soon, 90-day program, where I want to take people who have done such testing deep into their experience experientially and rewiring these schemas, essentially these internal working models from the ground up, and tracking that progress and really seeing results by working on the nervous system. So subscribe to the newsletter. I'll chuck a link in the description as well. And please like the video if you found it useful, and comment anything you found relevant. And yeah, guys, I will see you in the next episode.